So our last speaker today is Dr. Fredric Janzen. He's the director of the W.K. Kellogg Biological Station at Michigan State University. And he is going to talk about some of his work that he's done on climate change and environmental sex determination, an unnatural future. So we have had some climate change. How is that going to affect our herps, basically?
All right, thanks everybody. I guess I get to bat cleanup today. Hope I can do that justice. Obviously heard a lot of really neat reptile biology today. And what I'm going to talk about is actually research that I'd done before I came to Michigan. For those that don't know, I'm now the director of Kellogg Biological Station. As of June 1st, started in the midst of the pandemic. Do not recommend starting a new job in the middle of a pandemic. But nonetheless, here we are with another form of climate change that I'm going to talk about today on some of my long-term research involving turtles and what that might mean for the future. So as we're all aware, the environment is changing rapidly in a variety of different ways. To a considerable extent, we think about it from the perspective of this National Geographic cover here in terms of global warming and change at that sort of level. But you know what? We're changing the environment in all sorts of other kind of radically different ways, right? From the way that we do agriculture to the way that we harvest trees in terms of forestry. But we're also changing the thermal environment and other kinds of things by our cities and towns, how we construct up in the upper right corner, not the greatest picture, but our housing developments and even the minor modest habitat changes those entail, and including things that we're pretty familiar with in Michigan, the kind of stuff that we put into our water. All of these are changing the environments and all have pretty dramatic impacts on the biota that we need to try to figure out and resolve. One of these groups that's particularly imperiled by environmental changes at all these kinds of scales includes turtles. And in fact, other than freshwater mollusks, and even more so than our well-known declining amphibians, it turns out that turtles likely comprise the most endangered major group of animals on Earth. As it stands, roughly 2/3 of the living species are on the IUCN's red list. And what's puzzling about this is that as humans, we seem to revere turtles, and yet if we revere and respect them so much, why is it the case that so many of them are in fact in trouble? Well, turtles have been around for a really long time. I thought I'd start by just sort of rehashing this, that they've been around for 250 million years. So they've clearly established satisfactory survival in response to other kinds of climatic and other environmental upheavals throughout history. Some starting, like Proganachilles here, for example. But what's happening today is occurring at a dramatically different rate. One of the other interesting things about turtles, of course, is that the diversity and uniqueness of them has sort of promoted their sort of appearance in religious and mythological stories around the world. And just a few examples that I'm showing here that illustrate this fact. And again, the diversity and uniqueness of turtles has promoted their ubiquity in popular culture too, from advertisements to books, Grateful Dead album cover for the music aficionados of the 60s and 70s. And so that's really interesting, right? And it turns out that Michigan too is really important for turtles. It's just focusing for the moment on continental North America. And you can see that, there's a pretty impressive distribution on the left here of turtle density in terms of the darkness, if you will, of the red color. And overall in North America, there are 7 families of turtles and at least, anyway, 62 species. And 4 of those families and 10 of those species occur in Michigan. And we've heard some of those today, including the box turtles, the Blandings turtles, spotted turtles, and wood turtles are particularly notable. And so if they're in trouble, well, what has caused the decline? Sure, predation and other what you might consider natural processes do in fact limit populations and adversely affect them in some cases. Examples here, Jen just mentioned mesopredators like that nest in the, and we might even consider the macropredator on the sea turtle in the lower right. But let's face it, human factors dominate in terms of threats to turtle survival across the globe. Food consumption is one contributor to their decline. Probably, at least contemporarily, it's primarily occurring in Southeast Asia, but somewhat in Africa and South America, less so anymore anyways in North America. The pet trade's a big factor. It's probably more limited to animals like tortoises and chelonians that are, well, like the box turtles and wood turtles and so on, that are more terrestrial than otherwise. And then, of course, there's a whole array of human impacts in a sort of encounter sense. So roadkill, again, we've heard about that today, toxins, sad target practice, and other sorts of things. You can see some of them in the lower right, target practice of gopher tortoises in Florida. But again, as we've heard, and this is true for the vast majority of organisms that are in trouble, it's loss and alteration of habitat and environment that's causing the decline. But as I'm about to allude to, there's more, it turns out, with turtles. And here I'm going to transition a little bit to, I guess you could say, more, I guess, hardcore biology. I'm going to introduce you to what we call types of sex-determining mechanisms, and you'll see why that's important in a minute with respect to turtles. And so the kind of sex determination where we produce males and females that we're most familiar with is what we call in biology genotypic sex determination, or GSD. And these are the kinds of sex determining mechanisms where there are genetic factors, right at conception, right at that moment of fertilization, that determine, for the most part, whether an individual is likely to have testes or ovaries, right? A reproductive male or a reproductive female. And humans are one of these examples where, again, what we call gonadal sex is determined at conception by these genetic factors. But it turns out there's a whole other major type of sex determining mechanism called environmental sex determination, or ESD for short. And this is different in that there's some environmental cue during some discrete period after conception that permanently determines the sex of the individual. So let's talk a little bit about that. Turns out that the taxonomic distribution of ESD is really, really broad. So I'm just giving you a smattering of the kinds of organisms that have a kind of environmental sex determination here, and I'm not going to belabor the point, but you can see, right, it's plants, it's aquatic invertebrates, it's nematodes, it's marine organisms, fish, but it also includes reptiles. And in fact, in reptiles, it's probably the group in which environmental sex determination is most widely distributed. In this case, temperature is the environmental cue that permanently determines the sex of the organisms. And this gives you, again, a sense of some of the reptiles groups where TSD, as it's known as for short, is almost ubiquitous. So in tortoises and sea turtles, it occurs in all crocodilians, it occurs in the charismatic tuatara, and it occurs in a variety of lizards, including the day gecko shown at the top. And what's interesting is that all these groups are also imperiled for other reasons, not having to do with TSD. So TSD adds, as we'll see, an additional risk. So let's define what I mean by TSD. And here's an example that I'm going to walk you through about how this occurs. And Jen gave a good verbal description of it. Here you're going to get a visual description of it. And what's plotted on the left is the percent of the offspring that are produced that are male. And at the bottom, it's the incubation temperature. And if you prefer Fahrenheit, 20 is about 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and 40 is cooking. That's about 100 degrees or so, a little over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, and then the black line is what we call a reaction norm. And here's what you can see from this. This is the most typical common form of TSD that occurs in reptiles, occurs in most turtles. In fact, And at cool temperatures, right, you can see that that line shows right up here, you get all boys, all boys, all boys. You can see at really warm temperatures in the lower right, you get all girls, all girls, all girls. And then there's this narrow range delimited by these yellow dashed lines. It's called the TRT, the transitional range temperatures, where you can get both boys and girls. But look at how narrow that is. That's only a couple of degrees or so. And I also want to point out this temperature actually right here, where you go from being more male to more female, or the other way around, right, where that reaction arm pivots, is called the pivotal temperature, and that'll be important later on here. All right, so why is this interesting? Well, it turns out there's more than just the practical conservation aspects of this. There's some basic biology that's important here. And what I mean by that is that sex ratio, the fraction of offspring that are boys relative to girls, turns out to be inextricably linked to that sex determining mechanism. And in turn, as we know, sex ratio is really important for the dynamics of populations, right? It's not going to be good to have too many boys or too many girls, in brief, right? So if that's true, and given how sensitive environmental sex determining mechanisms might be, how can they persist in all these kinds of diverse forms in the wild? Well, here's a little bit more visualization of how that might happen. So you look in the lower left here, you can see we have sex ratio, and here I've got girls on top and boys on the bottom. And this was the problem that vexed Charles Darwin. So for 150 years, we've been wondering about this particular problem. And his idea that he identified verbally was that natural selection, if you get too many of one sex, is going to tend to produce more of the other sex, right, the rarer sex, to eventually cause an equal number of the two sexes. And so you can start off in this line on the left, right, and it starts off even. And then there's something that causes females to be produced in excess, okay? And what Darwin's saying is that natural selection is going to say, well, then those moms that produce more boys are going to be favored. And so that sex ratio is gradually going to go down. And you're going to get this kind of dynamic fluctuation where it eventually reaches an equilibrium again of one boy to one girl. All right, so that's the problem, but environmental sex determination poses a real challenge. And so to try to get at the bottom of this and what this means for reptiles, my lab for the last couple of decades or so has been addressing this problem from two perspectives. The first one is essentially asking what I call a contemporary question. That is, under current circumstances, how sensitive is TSD in the wild to current climatic variation? And then the second question we've been asking, which is about predicting what's going to happen into the future, is what are the evolutionary genetic underpinnings of TSD in the wild? In other words, does it have the capacity to evolve in response to that natural selection on sex ratio that we visualize? So the main study organism I've worked with is the painted turtle, and I'm not going to walk you through all the details on this particular slide. But by and large, it's not going to be a surprise. It has TSD. It actually occurs throughout North America. And importantly for us, in terms of the kind of science we were doing, it's not imperiled, or at least not yet. Another interesting aspect of its biology is the nests are relatively shallow. And the females typically nest at the end of May and in June. And an important point here, I should say, is that the temperature in those nests that matters to sex determination is more or less what happens in those nests in July. So how hot and cold those nests are in June or in August doesn't really matter in terms of sex determination. It's roughly July is the most important part in terms of temperature. The main population I'm going to talk to you about today, where we focused our efforts, is an island that occurs in the Mississippi River. We call it Turtle Camp, so I might accidentally say Turtle Camp a few times today. It's a very large population of a diversity of turtles, not just painted turtles. And students and I have been working at this site for, well, a third of a century. And we usually camp there for 6 weeks from mid-May to the end of June to thoroughly encompass the nesting season. And like others, I would definitely want to acknowledge the tremendous groups of students who've volunteered and been paid through the years. These are different years turtle camp crews that have contributed to the tremendous amount of work that's necessary to gather the data that I'm going to talk about today. So don't be fooled into thinking that I'm the one that did the hard work. It's these guys. So one of the questions that's really important is these painted turtles occur in the river or in any kind of aquatic body, right? And they're really common in Michigan too. But when these turtles come out to nest in May and June, the moms have basically a question to ask, and that is, where shall I nest, right? And one of the things that's important here is if she's coming out, say, on the 1st of June, she needs to be able to pick some environmental cue that's likely to predict what the thermal environment is in her nest, right, almost a month later in July. So what's going to do that? Now, remember, these turtles nest during the day. And so one of the things we thought that might be important, as shown in the lower right here, is that a female might come out and somehow sense the overstory canopy at a particular location, right? Whether it's cloudy on a given day isn't important, right? Because that's really transient. But what the trees and the other vegetation are that surround a particular spot she chooses, that might be more permanent, or at least for a month, right? So these females come out, we monitor those kinds of factors as these females nest. Here's an example. The female's done nesting, she deposits her eggs and leaves them. And then what do? We do a variety of different things. Here's me with one of our high school student interns on the left, excavating a nest. We do that. We put a temperature logger in the nest, among other things. After we put the eggs back in, we, shown in the upper right, we measure very precisely where these nests are located. And then at the end of incubation, end of summer, we go back. It's always been the 3rd Saturday in September, to excavate the nests that survive predation, which in more recent years, again, it's not very many. The mesopredator release is a real thing in this population too. But what we hope we find is shown in the lower right, which is a painted turtle baby with its eye barely open. It's not quite ready to meet the bright day sunlight of September. And the reason that might be true is that painted turtles, unlike many species of turtles, actually hatch out of the eggs in August and September, but then they usually stay in the nest until the following April or May. And so the beauty of that trait for painted turtles is that we go back in September and any turtles that have hatched are still there. They haven't departed the nest yet. We get complete sampling. And like I said, we monitor nest temperatures. This is just the black line here is a temperature trace from a snapping turtle nest. And what's neat about this particular one, you can see the horizontal dash green line is that pivotal temperature for these snapping turtles. And look at that nest temperature in July, right? Back and forth across that pivotal temperature, kind of neat. All right, but what we really hope when we come back in September is we find this, right? A lovely batch of baby painted turtles ready to roll. And so let's start addressing these empirical challenges. And the first one has to do, again, with how sensitive is TSD to climatic variation. And here's the results of, well, the first 32 years of our study. And this is a bit of a complicated slide, I think, maybe not, but there's 3 messages I want you to be able to take away from it. How about that? And so here we go. Like that original slide where I showed you that pattern of TSD with what I call that black reaction norm, here this plot is more or less the same thing. Again, we have the percent males on that vertical left axis there. And on the bottom now, we kind of have the incubation temperature, but here we have the average air temperature in July, right? During that time when the sex is sensitive to temperature in the nest. Each of the sort of 2-digit numbers in color inside this whole graph are the last 2 digits of a particular year. So for example, right, this in the upper left here is 2009, was a particularly chilly July. And well, 1988, for those who might remember, was a wicked hot July and dry. And then a bunch of years in between and so on, right? And so the 3 points I'd like you to walk away from this with. Number one is look at that gray line here. That is the statistically best fit line to all those data points, one for for each year. And I should point out, there are some years missing because of complete predation, or, and I mentioned this is the Mississippi River site, years where the river flooded and destroyed all the nests. But nonetheless, this is pretty remarkable, right? So point one is that this sex ratio reaction norm in the wild definitely reflects what we see in the lab when we incubate eggs at a constant temperature. So that's pretty cool.
Fred, just one second, 5-minute warning, okay?
Oh my, okay.
I know.
I'm not talking fast enough, or I put too much junk in, right? Point number two, this temperature here at about 23.8 is the overall grand mean air temperature in July at this site over about 80 years, right? And if you take this point and you go up to the gray line and then over, holy moly, look at that. It looks like on average over the course of this time, you get roughly one boy for every one girl. So that's pretty interesting. But the third point I want you to take from this is also, look what happens when we warm the air temperature, oh, 1.5 degrees, say, or cool it 1.5 degrees. You go from roughly 1-to-1 to pretty much on average, all boys or all girls. So in the wild, they're sensitive to temperature, the sex ratio, and it's really sensitive. It's exquisitely sensitive. It doesn't take much to have a dramatic impact. And it's not just the babies, right? You can look at it, sure, from this, where on the left, you can see that's the current situation where the red nests are the girl producing nests, the blue ones are the boy ones, the yellow ones are mixed. And on the right, if July is just 1 degree warmer, there's a lot more red. And this matters beyond boys. And I'm not going to belabor this point, but it basically says that on the bottom, it's the number of female babies that were born in a particular year. And on the upper left, it's how many brand new for the first time nesting moms appeared in the population 6 years later, which is the age when they first mature. So you can see that years when a lot of girls are born, 6 years later, you get a lot of brand new moms. So this sex ratio at birth has a really big impact on the population. So how can they respond to this? We've identified a bunch of different factors. One is, well, they could evolve a different sex determining mechanism. They could evolve GSD. And that's just not the kind of thing, right, an organism snaps their fingers and does. They could actively alter their geographic range, and it's possible this was important in geologic time. But you know, with the advent of our roads, subdivisions, all sorts of development by human, that's just not likely to happen without actually active assistance. So we think there's two other possibilities. They can evolve that thermal sensitivity of sex determination, or the moms can evolve their nesting behavior. Because if they don't, they're going to face extinction. And so we've tried to identify two factors, the sensitivity of embryonic sex determination and this maternal choice of nest thermal qualities, as important traits for us to focus on in terms of being able to evolve. And so here's that sex ratio reaction norm. And what do I mean by evolve? I mean, they can move it, say, from the left to the right. If climate warms, maybe it just shifts to the right. And is there genetic variation for them to be able to do that? And the other thing is maybe the nesting, right? Here's a female, she's nesting out in the open. And you know, climate warms and she says, yeah, I need to choose a shadier site. So she moves here into the shade of this tree, right? So is there genetic, you know, underpinnings for that kind of thing to happen? And I'm not going to describe the details of the evolutionary genetic underpinnings. I'm simply going to give you some quick answers here for where we examined a physiological trait, this pivotal temperature at the top, and then two nesting behavior traits in the middle and bottom. Heritability, that's what H² refers to, ranges from 0 to 1. The more heritable a trait is, its value is closer to 1, and that means the more likely it's going to be able to evolve in response to natural selection. The closer to 0, the more out of luck they are. And so you don't have to be a genius to see that these numbers are awfully low. And so at best, they have a modest capacity to evolve in response to selection caused by climate change. So how resilient are they going to be? Right? Here's a poor snapping turtle crossing the highway in New Orleans after a hurricane. Well, some of the studies that my lab have ongoing with a bunch of collaborators elsewhere are looking at populations of painted turtles across North America that, in these black stars, that already occur in dramatically different climatic regimes, right? So in southern New Mexico here, near the southern edge of their range, you can see that's not a surprise, a hotter climate than it is here in northern Idaho and so forth. Right, so we're asking the question, how have these turtles with TSD already solved the sex ratio problem under current conditions? And one of our key findings, and just focus on that panel up at the top, and you can see this is for half a dozen of those populations. If you look at the left side where it says nest, you can see that nest temperature, all those different colored balls, circles, are all pretty close together. So each of those populations, the moms are choosing nest sites that produce temperatures that are only a couple of degrees apart on average, whether they're in Idaho or New Mexico. And what's interesting is you can compare that to the part on the right there where it says representative. And that is if you measure the temperature environment at nest depth in a representative location within the same nesting area at each of those locations, it's totally different. So these moms are indeed choosing sites non-randomly to manipulate temperature to be really similar no matter what part of the geographic range those populations occur in. So that's kind of cool. So in the end here on the conclusions, not sure how I'm doing, but I'm about done. We know that turtles are an iconic component of our local and our global biodiversity. And of course, they're heavily integrated into human cultures, right? Most human cultures value turtles. But what do we learn from some things anyways, from some of the research from my lab? And that is that turtles with TSD that I've shown today, at least the painted turtles, are exquisitely sensitive to variation in local climatic conditions. And I'm talking here kind of more or less at that sort of nest level. So altered thermal environments are definitely going to imperil these animals. And most of these populations of most of these species with TSD are in fact already in trouble. And finally, turtles with TSD really only have, as I've shown, a modest evolutionary capacity to manipulate nest sex ratios. They might have what we call plasticity, but we don't yet know if that's important. But if they cannot evolve in response to the sex ratio selection, the world's going to be a pretty dreary place, right? We're going to have at most maybe a few species of turtles. And you can think about it this way. Think of it outside of the typical reptiles and think about our avian friends. And how satisfied would you be if we had birds, but what if they were only house sparrows, starlings, pigeons, and crows? And there's nothing wrong with those, but the diversity would be pretty wanting. So let me again conclude, acknowledge funding sources, many grad students and undergrad and high school students and colleagues and collaborators over the year, and happy to take questions. Thank you.
You are fine on time. Thank you for, yeah, phew, it's hot, right? It's been a long day. I realize that for everyone. We've been from 10 o'clock until almost 3 o'clock. Feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A. I don't see any questions yet, but can you give us some hope for the future? It seems like with climate change and everything happening, it can really affect especially our reptile populations. Are there any things that we could maybe do? Obviously, each one of us can't affect the climate directly and say, in this spot, we're going to make it ideal for our turtles. But are there any take homes that land managers could do to help these guys?
I suppose my opinion at this point is that we actually need more research on these animals. What I'm beginning to understand, I think, and part of it's from this painted turtle work, is that wide-ranging species like painted turtles, like red-eared slider turtles, common snapping turtles, are probably going to maybe not, and even some of the sea turtles, not give us the same kind of insights into how we need to adapt to help them adapt to changing climatic conditions, because they already colonize a diversity of habitats. The ones I think we have to worry about, and the ones where I think we need the more information to answer the question, Ellen, that you pose, are the spotted turtles and some of the, and even the eastern box turtles and so forth, ones that have a more limited geographic range that, you know, we might have to, again, study more and get a better understanding of sex determination and the nesting sites that these moms prefer, and what that can mean to population dynamics. And I think, frankly, you know, Jem's work with the eastern box turtles is a great example of how we're starting to get it takes time, but starting to get these really excellent baseline data that we need on the nesting biology and what the babies do.
So a question that I have, would we need to maybe, I know there's been talk of like bird populations or other populations migrating farther north as climates change, or vice versa, depending on what they need. Would we need to help maybe these turtles migrate in a way, since they do have such limited ranges? Is that even a thought process that's going through the research community?
Yeah, there are some really smart biologists who are doing that kind of work. Some of it's been pioneered, frankly, in New Zealand by the folks working on tuatara, moving them from island to island and so forth. I think some of the Aussie researchers as well, where they've been pioneering the discussion at minimum of what they call assisted migration. So moving populations north or otherwise to places as a conservation tool to kind of have in the toolkit. But yeah, it's definitely getting some attention. I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah, no, I didn't expect you to be an expert on that. But no, it just gets you thinking about what different things could we do, or what extremes do we need to take other than what we've been doing with turtles in terms of just helping them with predation. There might be even more things that we may need to do to help save some of our populations. So great presentation.